I watched Darnell Price sit at a desk nobody wanted, quietly repairing a failure 3 engineers had abandoned after 3 days. Then the regional manager, Victoria Wainwright, walked in, looked at his plain shirt, and asked coldly, "Who let you in here?" Before he could answer, she called building security and announced she was going to clear out people who did not belong. He closed the laptop, opened an email that had taken effect at 8 that morning, and said, "You won't need them anymore." Victoria laughed at him. Then Darnell pressed the button that ended her career, and the room went silent. If you enjoy watching contempt collapse under the weight of the truth, subscribe now and stay with me while Darnell makes Victoria pay. The morning at the Charlotte office of Halcyon Grid Solutions began the way a bad week ends, with too much coffee and not enough answers. A distribution layer that moved client data between 4 regional nodes had been failing intermittently for 3 days, dropping packets in a pattern nobody could reproduce on demand, and every attempt to patch it had made the logs longer without making the problem smaller. I could feel the tension in that building before anyone said a word about it, the kind of tension that lives in the way people type. A national utility client held a service agreement with penalty language that turned ugly if the outage crossed the 72-hour mark, and that mark arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The engineers had stopped talking about fixing it and started talking about explaining it. That is always the sound of a team that has quietly surrendered. Darnell Price arrived a few minutes after 7, and almost nobody noticed him. There was no black car idling at the curb, no assistant carrying a folder 2 steps behind him, no tailored jacket cut to announce a salary. He wore a dark blue shirt with the sleeves already rolled to the forearm, dark trousers, and shoes that had been resoled at least once. Over his shoulder hung a laptop bag worn soft at the corners, and the machine inside it carried a scatter of stickers from conferences and data centers, and one faded decal from a hospital network he had helped rebuild after a storm took out half the eastern grid. He was 41 years old, and he had spent 11 of those years inside this company, mostly in rooms without windows, mostly on nights when something was broken. Nothing about him asked to be looked at twice. The woman at the front desk had received an access request from headquarters the previous evening, so she printed his badge, handed it across the counter, and told him the technical floor was up on 3. Then he rode the elevator up alone, found the technical wing, and chose the emptiest desk in the room, the one at the far end near the environmental panel where the air handler made a low rattle that most people found unbearable after an hour. He set the laptop down, plugged into the wall port instead of the wireless, and started reading logs. He did not introduce himself to the room. He did not ask where the good coffee was. Nathaniel Brooks noticed the name on the badge about 20 minutes later and felt something click into place. Nathaniel was 34, a systems engineer who had come up through a state school and a lot of stubbornness, and he had spent his first year at the company studying an internal architecture document that had shaped the way he thought about failover design ever since. The author line on that document read D. Price. Nathaniel had assumed the man was retired, or promoted into some abstract office where people stopped writing anything technical, or possibly invented by the documentation team as a joke. Seeing him in a folding chair beside a rattling air handler was like finding a cathedral architect fixing a doorknob. He walked over with his coffee and stood there for a second too long before speaking. "Mr. Price, you came down from corporate?" Darnell did not look up from the terminal, but his voice was warm enough to remove any sting from the brevity. "Today I just need the system running again." Nathaniel asked whether he wanted the incident summary, and Darnell said he had already read it twice on the plane and that the summary was describing the symptom rather than the disease. He asked instead for the raw scheduler logs going back 9 days. Not 3, because whatever had broken on Monday had almost certainly been planted the previous week by something that looked harmless at the time. Nathaniel pulled the files in 4 minutes, sat down at the next desk without being invited, and began learning more in that hour than he had in the previous 2 quarters. Neither man mentioned titles again. What nobody in that building knew, and what I knew from the beginning, was that at 8 o'clock that morning a decision made in a boardroom 400 miles away had quietly taken legal effect. The board of Halcyon Grid Solutions had spent the previous evening finalizing a restructuring that collapsed 3 layers of regional oversight into a single executive office, and Graham Whitlock, the chairman, had signed the appointment himself at 11 minutes past 10 the night before. Darnell Price was now Senior Vice President of Operations, with authority over every regional office in the company and every regional general manager who ran one. The company-wide announcement was scheduled for 4 o'clock that afternoon, held until then only because the legal team wanted one final closing signature on an unrelated acquisition before the news went out. Darnell had known for 6 days. He had told exactly one person, and she was 11 years old, and had asked whether it meant he would be home less. He was not thinking about any of that at 7:30. He was thinking about a timing drift in a synchronization service that nobody had touched in 14 months, and about the fact that the drift only appeared when a scheduled maintenance job overlapped with a certain kind of client query. He had come to Charlotte in person rather than dialing into a bridge call, because he had learned early that failures like this one are rarely visible from a distance, and because a system is not just software, it is the habits of the people who run it. His phone buzzed face up on the desk, a reminder he had set himself the previous night, 1 line of plain text telling him to call home at 7 and check whether the fractions worksheet had actually been finished this time. He smiled at that, turned the phone face down, and went back to the logs. Then he stopped smiling and started typing quickly, because he had just found the pattern. By 9 o'clock he had isolated it, and the isolation was elegant enough that Nathaniel actually said a word out loud that he immediately apologized for. A legacy maintenance routine, written years earlier by a contractor who was long gone, was requesting a lock on a table it no longer needed, and under load that lock was arriving a fraction of a second before the synchronization handshake instead of after it. 3 days of engineers had been staring at the network layer because the symptom looked like packet loss. The disease lived somewhere else entirely, in a scheduling assumption made in a different decade. Darnell wrote the correction, staged it, and started the resynchronization job, which would need roughly 90 minutes to walk through every node and confirm integrity before it declared itself finished. Then he sat back, drank cold coffee, and waited, which is the part of the work nobody ever puts in a story. At 9:20, Victoria Wainwright arrived, and the building changed temperature. Her car stopped directly in front of the entrance in a space that was not a space, and she left it there because someone always moved it for her. She was 38 years old, regional general manager of the Charlotte office, and she carried herself like a woman who had never once had to wonder whether a room would make space for her. The Wainwright name meant something in certain rooms in this state, mostly rooms with membership fees, and she had grown up understanding money as a language rather than a resource. Her numbers were good, which is the reason a great many things about her had been tolerated for a very long time. I want to be precise about that, because it matters later. Nobody protected her out of affection. They protected her out of arithmetic. She had a rule she was proud of, and she said it out loud at conferences, as though it were wisdom rather than a confession. She claimed she could read a person in 4 seconds. A good jacket meant a conversation. A certain watch meant respect. A technician meant a task that should already be finished. She had built an entire professional identity out of the belief that authority announced itself visually, and she had never been in a situation that punished her for it. The people who could have corrected her outranked her too little or knew her too well, and the people who wanted to correct her could not afford to. That is how a bad habit becomes a management style. Audrey Keene met her at the elevator with the morning folder, as she had every workday for 4 years. Audrey was 46, quiet, precise, and much smarter than her title suggested, and she had watched things in this office that she had never written down. She had watched a scheduler get reduced to tears over a misprinted agenda. She had watched a junior analyst learn to stop suggesting things. She had told herself, more than once, that a paycheck is a kind of promise you make to the people at home, and that the promise was worth the silence. That morning, she noticed something new in her own chest as she handed over the folder, and it took her most of the day to recognize it as shame. Victoria walked the floor the way some people inspect property, and halfway down the technical wing she stopped. There was a man she did not recognize sitting at a desk near the environmental panel, a black man in his 40s in a plain shirt with no jacket anywhere in sight. And he was not merely sitting in her office, he was working at a terminal with a live connection to the control layer. She did not ask Nathaniel who he was. She did not check the morning access log that sat 2 clicks away on her own tablet. She did not call the front desk, which would have answered in 9 seconds. She walked straight at him, and her voice carried farther than it needed to. "Who are you?" Darnell kept his eyes on the progress indicator because interrupting the job to be polite would have cost the company money it did not know it was about to lose. "Darnell Price," he said. She waited. She was waiting for the second half, the part where a man in a plain shirt explains himself, lists his supervisor, offers his credentials like a passport at a border. He gave her 2 more words instead. Corporate operations. She looked at the badge clipped to his belt, then at the battered laptop, and something in her expression settled into a conclusion she had already reached before she asked the question. She asked whether he was contracted IT, one of the outside vendors the company used for overflow work. He said no. She asked why he was seated in her building without reporting to her first, and he answered without heat that he had been asked to resolve a system failure and had started at 7 because the deadline was at 4. "Everyone in this building reports to me," she said, and I have thought a great deal about that sentence since. It was true in the way she meant it, and it had been true for 6 years, and it would be false in a manner more total than she could imagine before lunch. She said it the way people say things they have never had to defend. Nathaniel opened his mouth to explain that this was the man who had designed the failover architecture they all worked inside, and got 4 words out before she cut him in half. "I wasn't asking you." Nathaniel sat down. Darnell finally looked up, and he looked at her for a full 3 seconds, which is a long time in a conversation. He was not measuring her the way she had measured him. He was doing something more dangerous. He was noticing the room, the way 11 people had gone very still without appearing to, the way Nathaniel had folded himself smaller in his chair with the reflex of a man who had done it before, the way the woman with the folder was studying the carpet. He had come here to fix a scheduling fault. He was beginning to understand that the scheduling fault was the smaller of the 2 problems in that office. He said nothing at all and turned back to the screen. Victoria told him to get up from the desk. He explained, still evenly, that the resynchronization was 38 minutes into a 90-minute cycle, that interrupting it would force a full restart, and that a restart would push completion past the contractual deadline that afternoon. It was a factual answer offered to a person who was not asking a factual question. She looked at the plain shirt again and let her mouth do something that was almost a smile. "Corporate usually sends people down with a little more polish than this," she said. There it was, out loud, in front of a dozen people, dressed up just carefully enough that she could have denied it in a deposition. He did not respond, and his silence confirmed everything she already believed. In her arithmetic, a man who does not fight back is a man with nothing to fight with. She turned to Audrey and told her to look up the name. Audrey typed it into the internal directory and found the record immediately, because of course it was there, 11 years of it. But the human resources system had been updated at 8 o'clock that morning, and where the title field should have displayed a role, it displayed something else entirely. Executive access. The record read, confidential. Audrey read it twice and felt the floor tilt very slightly. She turned the tablet so Victoria could see. Any reasonable person, given that phrase on a company screen, stops, steps back, makes one phone call to headquarters before saying another word. Victoria looked at those two words and reached the only conclusion her 4-second rule permitted, which was that the system was wrong. "You seem to have been granted more access than you ought to have," she said. Darnell asked her a question then, and he asked it so gently that it landed harder than shouting. "What are you basing that on? What tells you the level of access I ought to have?" She had no answer prepared because nobody had ever required one. She said she knew who belonged in her office, and he said, "Do you know them by their names or by how they look?" The air in that wing changed. Somebody's keyboard stopped. Audrey looked up from the carpet for the first time in 5 minutes and looked directly at Victoria. And Victoria felt it. And that was the moment the whole thing stopped being about a stranger at a desk and became about an audience. She converted it into a security matter, which is what people do when they need a neutral word for a personal impulse. She demanded to see his work authorization. He turned the laptop slightly and opened the message from headquarters, sent the previous evening by the office of the Chief Operations Coordinator, listing his name, the incident number, the site, and the duration. She read perhaps a line and a half of it. 2 paragraphs down sat a sentence that would have ended the entire morning had she reached it. "Mr. Price holds full operational authority for the duration of his visit." She never got there. What she noticed instead was that the message had not come from Graham Whitlock personally, and in her world, a name at the bottom of a page is the only thing that makes the page real. "An email doesn't make you important," she said, handing the laptop back with 2 fingers. Darnell said, "I never said I was important," and there was not a trace of sarcasm in it, which is precisely why it worked. Somewhere behind her, a young analyst looked down at her desk very quickly. Victoria heard both sounds and understood exactly what they were, and I have never seen a person's pride catch fire so fast. Up to that point, she had been dismissive. From that point on, she was something worse, because now there was a crowd. She raised her voice and told the floor to stop working. About 20 people turned around, and a few of them stood up, because when a manager says, "Stop," in that tone you obey with your whole body before your mind catches up. "This," she announced, "is exactly why we do not allow outside individuals to walk into this office and put their hands on our systems." Nathaniel stood up out of his chair, and I will always give him credit for that, because he knew precisely what it would cost. "Mr. Price has already found the fault that we've been," and Victoria turned on him with the speed of long practice. "Nathaniel, one more sentence, and you can clear out your desk alongside him." He sat down. Darnell checked the corner of his screen, where the progress indicator read a little over 17 minutes remaining, and made a decision that a lot of people would not have made. He decided that the job mattered more than his dignity did for the next 17 minutes, and he stayed in the chair and said nothing, and he let her have the room. I want to be honest about the cost of that choice, because stories like this one often pretend it is free. It is not free. There is a specific weight to sitting still while a person invents a version of you in front of 20 witnesses, and it does not lift just because you are right. Victoria read his stillness as fear, and she began to enjoy herself. "Some people walk into a nice office," she said, pacing slowly enough to be seen, "and immediately start imagining they belong in it. Nobody made a sound. We maintain standards in this building, and standards are not a formality. She stopped directly behind his chair, and she delivered the line that I suspect she has replayed in her head every night since. You cannot simply sit down at a desk and behave as though you own it. The resynchronization job ticked over to 16 minutes. Darnell did not turn around. She told Audrey to deactivate his badge, and Audrey hesitated for the first time in 4 years. And that hesitation lasted maybe a second and a half. Then she opened the facility's console and entered the credential number, because she was still the person she had been at 8 that morning. The screen returned a response none of them had ever seen before, in capital letters that did not offer a workaround. Access denied. Executive credentials cannot be modified at the local level. Audrey read it aloud in a flat voice, and then she read it a second time, and something in her chest went very quiet and very clear. That was the second unmistakable signal, and Victoria discarded it as fast as she had discarded the first. She said the corporate system was obviously malfunctioning, which was a remarkable thing to conclude about a security platform whose entire purpose is not to malfunction. She said she would have it corrected by the afternoon, and Darnell, who had watched her collect 2 pieces of evidence and refuse both, asked her a question that he did not have to ask, and that I believe he asked out of something close to mercy. Victoria, are you certain you want to keep going with this? It was the first time he had used her first name. The reaction was immediate and physical, the way it always is with people whose authority is mostly costume. You will call me Ms. Wainwright. Darnell nodded once. All right, Ms. Wainwright, are you certain? And she looked at him sitting there in his plain shirt, with his scratched laptop and his 11 years, and she said, completely. That word is the hinge of this entire story. Everything before it could have been walked back with an apology and a slightly embarrassed lunch. Everything after it belonged to her, freely chosen, in front of witnesses, with 2 written warnings already on the screen behind her. She took out her phone and dialed building security, and she did it standing in the middle of the technical wing, where every person present could hear both halves of the conversation. This is Victoria Wainwright, Regional General Manager, 3rd floor. I have an individual in a restricted area who is not authorized to be here and is refusing to leave. Darnell turned his chair a few degrees and looked at her, and what was on his face was not anger. I have watched a great many people receive that kind of treatment, and the anger is usually the first thing you see. What he showed instead was disappointment, which is a far heavier thing to be handed, because anger says you surprised me, and disappointment says you did not. The officer on the line asked the standard sequence of questions, and this is where the whole performance began to come apart in real time. Is the individual behaving in a threatening manner toward anyone? Victoria's jaw tightened. No. Is he being physically uncooperative or attempting to access restricted equipment by force? No. Then what exactly is he doing, ma'am? She looked at Darnell, who was sitting perfectly still in a chair with his hands in his lap and a progress bar counting down behind him. He is sitting at a computer, she said. Even she heard it. I am certain of that. There was a fractional pause in her breathing, the sound of a person listening to her own sentence arrive in a room, and if she had been alone in her office, she would have laughed at herself, apologized, and gone to lunch. But she was not alone. She had 20 employees watching. She had a technician who had refused to be humiliated, and she had built the last 4 minutes into a public demonstration of who ran this floor. Backing out now would have cost her the only thing she genuinely valued. So she asked for officers immediately, and the dispatcher told her the response time would be roughly 8 minutes. She ended the call and let her arm drop. You have 8 minutes to walk out on your own, she said. Before they walk you out, Darnell asked mildly. And if they arrive and find that I'm authorized to be here? She actually laughed at that, a short, high sound with no humor anywhere near it. "You still believe you're authorized," he said. "I asked a question, that's all." And she said the sentence that Audrey would repeat, word for word, in a formal statement 11 days later. "And I am giving you a chance to avoid being humiliated." Darnell looked around the room then, slowly, and he was not looking for allies. He was taking inventory. 2 people were visibly frightened, and one of them was a woman in her 20s who had started 6 weeks earlier and was now learning exactly what this place was. 3 or 4 had turned their eyes away from him entirely, not out of contempt but out of the specific cowardice that offices manufacture, the kind where you tell yourself that looking away is neutral. Nathaniel was gripping the arm of his chair hard enough to whiten his knuckles, furious and useless and knowing it. Audrey had put her tablet down on the desk and had not picked it back up, and she was standing very straight, and something in her had already decided something. And then the terminal chimed. It was a small, unremarkable sound, the same tone the software had used for a decade, and in the silence of that room it might as well have been a bell in a courthouse. Synchronization complete, all nodes verified, integrity confirmed. The fault that had defeated a full technical team for 71 hours was closed, 4.5 hours before the contractual penalty clause would have triggered, and a service agreement worth somewhere north of $40 million over its remaining term stayed exactly where it was. Nathaniel made a sound that was half laugh and half exhale. Darnell closed the diagnostic window without any visible reaction at all, because to him this was simply Tuesday. Then he opened his email, and he took his time about it. Victoria had perhaps 30 seconds of patience left in her entire body. "What are you doing?" Darnell moved through his inbox unhurried, checking whether a decision has taken effect. Her lip curled. "What decision?" He did not answer her. He opened a message flagged with a header that Audrey, standing at an angle behind him, could read clearly, and which caused her to take one involuntary step forward. "Board confidential. Effective 8 o'clock. He read 4 lines of it, and then he did something that changed the shape of the room. He opened a second application, and it was not one that any employee in that building had ever been able to open. Victoria saw the interface load and did not recognize it, which was itself the answer to everything, though she was not ready to hear it. It was not the standard employee portal with its friendly blue header and its holiday calendar. It was the Executive Human Resources console, the one that surfaces reporting structures, compensation bands, disciplinary records, and termination authority, and it exists on maybe 19 machines in the entire company. Darnell typed a name into the search field with 2 fingers, unhurried, and turned his shoulder just slightly so that the screen was no longer private. The name he typed was Victoria Wainwright. The smile left her face in stages, the way paint comes off a wall. The record populated. Victoria Wainwright, Regional General Manager, Charlotte. Tenure, 6 years and 4 months. Direct reports, 140. And below that, in the field labeled Reporting Executive, a line that had been written into the database at precisely 8 o'clock that morning by a system in another state. Reporting Executive, Darnell Price, Senior Vice President of Operations. She stared at it. She read it 3 times. Then she said, in a voice that had lost about 40% of its volume, that it was obviously an error in the record. Darnell turned the laptop so that Audrey and Nathaniel could see it clearly, because he wanted witnesses to the fact rather than to the moment. He explained it in 5 sentences, without any of the flourishes the scene invited. The board had approved a restructuring of regional oversight the previous evening. The chairman had signed the appointment personally. It had taken legal effect at 8 that morning. The company-wide announcement was scheduled for 4 o'clock, delayed only by an unrelated legal closing. And he had come to Charlotte a day early to fix a system failure himself, because that was still the part of the work he understood best. Victoria's mouth moved before her voice arrived. You're my superior?" Darnell nodded once. since 8 o'clock this morning. And here is the detail I want to be very precise about because it is the difference between this story and a cheap one. He did not say it triumphantly. He said it the way a doctor gives a diagnosis, evenly, with no pleasure in it, because he had already moved on to the part that actually mattered to him. He was no longer thinking about being disrespected. He was thinking about 140 people who had spent 6 years reporting to a woman who had just tried to have a man removed from a building for sitting quietly at a desk. Because the reveal was not the end of it. While she stood there recalculating her entire morning, Darnell opened a blank incident record and began to type, and he typed steadily for close to 2 minutes while nobody in that wing moved. He documented that a regional general manager had obstructed an authorized corporate engineer during an active service restoration on a contract with penalty exposure. He documented an attempt to revoke executive credentials at the local level. He documented a direct threat of termination made to an employee for offering factual information. He documented a materially false characterization of the situation to building security, in which a seated technician was described as an unauthorized individual refusing to leave. And he documented risk of operational disruption during a live remediation window, which in this company is close to the worst phrase you can attach to a person's name. Victoria watched him type and made the transition that people in her position always make, and she made it faster than most. The contempt drained out of her posture and something soft and pleading slid in to replace it, and it was so complete and so instant that Nathaniel later said it was the most frightening thing he saw all day. "Darnell," she said warmly, "obviously this is all just a misunderstanding. We can sort this out privately." He stopped typing. He looked up at her, and he let 2 full seconds go by. "2 minutes ago," he said, "you instructed me to call you Ms. Wainwright." She had nothing. Her hands opened slightly at her sides. And Darnell finished the thought without raising his voice at all. And I think it was the single most satisfying sentence spoken in that building in 6 years. I think we should maintain that level of professionalism. Somewhere in the back of the room, the analyst who had started 6 weeks earlier put a hand over her mouth. Audrey Keene did not move a muscle, but she was at that moment composing a document in her head that would run to 11 pages. Victoria tried to save herself the way people with her upbringing always try, by reframing the offense as a virtue. She said she had been protecting the office. She said her responsibility was to the security of the systems and the people in this building, and that any manager in her position would have done the same. Darnell asked her, "Protecting it from what?" She opened her mouth and discovered there was no available answer, because every honest completion of that sentence would have ended her faster than the record he had just written. From a man with a valid badge. From a man with written authorization from headquarters. From the person who had just saved the contract she was standing there defending. He laid the whole sequence out for her, plainly, the way you walk a client through a failure report. He had entered through the front desk with a printed badge issued against a request from headquarters. He had carried a written authorization she had held in her own hands and declined to read past the first line and a half. His credentials had returned an executive-level response on her own facility's console, in capital letters, 10 minutes earlier. A senior engineer on her own staff had attempted twice to confirm who he was, and had been silenced both times. He had not raised his voice, refused an instruction with hostility, or made a single threatening gesture, and she had told a security dispatcher otherwise on a recorded line. "You had at least 5 separate opportunities to check a fact," Darnell said. "The front desk, your own access log, the authorization letter, the badge system, your engineer. He let that sit. You chose security instead. 5 times. And then he said the thing that made old Audrey Keene finally understand what she had been watching for 4 years. None of those 5 checks would have taken longer than the conversation you chose to have instead. You did not lack information. You declined it." He picked up his phone and stepped 4 paces away, not for privacy but out of courtesy, and called Marlo Bennett, the Chief Human Resources Officer, who was 52 years old and had been waiting since 8:15 that morning for exactly one of the 11 regional offices to do something stupid. He did not put her on speaker at first. He described the sequence in about 90 seconds, without adjectives, and Marlo listened without interrupting once, which was itself unusual. Then she told him something he had not known, and it reframed the entire morning. Victoria Wainwright's name had crossed her desk before, 4 times. There had been a complaint 2 years earlier from a billing coordinator, who described being belittled in front of a client, withdrawn 11 days later without explanation. There had been an anonymous submission about performance reviews being adjusted downward for employees who had raised process objections. There had been a resignation letter from a project scheduler that contained 1 paragraph the departing employee's final meeting had flagged, and nobody had followed. And there had been a report of retaliation from a contractor who was gone before anyone called her back. Individually, each had been thin, deniable, and inconvenient, and each time the regional numbers had been strong, and the file had been closed with a note recommending informal coaching. "What I never had," Marlo said, "was an incident with witnesses, a written record, and a corporate officer present." She asked him the question directly, and she asked it in her flattest professional register. "Do you want suspension pending investigation or immediate termination under the Management Conduct Clause?" Darnell looked at Victoria across 8 feet of carpet. She was standing absolutely still, and for the first time all morning she was completely silent, and I believe she understood in that silence that everything she had built rested on the assumption that the person in front of her would never be able to answer back. Darnell said one word: termination. Marlo confirmed it in writing in the time it takes to boil water. Darnell turned the laptop back around, entered his authorization, and the console asked him the question these systems always ask, the one designed to make you stop and consider. He read the confirmation prompt, and then he pressed it. Employment terminated. Effective immediately. Across 3 separate systems in 2 states, a set of permissions collapsed simultaneously. Her badge went inert, her corporate mail account locked. Her administrative rights over 140 personnel records evaporated between one breath and the next. "Mrs. Wainwright," Darnell said, "you are no longer the manager of this office." She looked down at the phone still in her hand. On the screen, the security request she had placed 9 minutes earlier sat open and active, the status line reading dispatched, the little icon pulsing, officers already in the stairwell because the elevator on that side of the building was slow and they knew it. She stared at it as though it were a message from a previous life, which in every meaningful sense it was. Darnell watched her look at it, and then he said it, and he said it quietly, without any edge at all, which made it perfect. "You won't need them anymore." The elevator opened on the far side of the floor. 2 officers stepped out, one older and one young enough to still find all of this interesting, and they walked the length of the technical wing through a silence so complete that you could hear the air handler rattling. The older one scanned the room the way trained people do and asked the obvious question. Who requested assistance? And Victoria Wainwright, running on 6 years of muscle memory and absolutely nothing else, stepped forward and said, "I did." She reached for her badge to identify herself, because that is the reflex, and the badge did not respond. The panel by the wing entrance stayed dark. She tried it a second time with the particular urgency of someone whose hands have not yet accepted what their mind already knows. Darnell did not let it go on. He stepped forward, introduced himself by name and title, and explained the situation in 3 sentences with no ornamentation whatsoever. "The matter has been resolved. Ms. Wainwright's employment was terminated a few moments ago." Human resources would appreciate your assistance with the standard building exit process. Nobody laughed. That is the part I keep coming back to. 20 people had just watched a woman who had humiliated them for years get dismantled in under a quarter of an hour, and not one of them made a sound, because Darnell had not made it a spectacle, and so nobody else could. He did not editorialize. He did not look at the room to check whether they had appreciated it. He treated her, in the worst 10 minutes of her professional life, with a level of procedural courtesy that she had never once extended to a subordinate. And that contrast did more damage to her than any insult could have. The older officer nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and stood aside to wait. That single syllable of address landed on her like a dropped plate. Victoria found her voice on the way to the elevator, and it came out with more heat than she intended. "You did this because I called security. All of this because I made one phone call." Darnell turned to face her. He let the pause run just long enough. "No." And in that gap, 20 people leaned forward without meaning to. "I did this because you demonstrated exactly how you use authority when you believe the person in front of you doesn't have any." He continued, "And this is the part I would want anyone to carry out of this story. If he had actually been what she assumed he was, a contract technician on a day rate with no protection and no recourse, every single she did that morning would have been just as wrong. The badge, the announcement to the floor, the threat to Nathaniel, the false report to a dispatcher, the phrase about people imagining they belong. None of that becomes acceptable because the target turns out to be Junior. His title did not make her conduct wrong. His title only meant that the consequence arrived in 15 minutes instead of never. And the fact that it usually arrives never was, he said, the actual problem in this building. Victoria looked around the technical wing one last time, and she was looking for a face. Any face. Someone she had promoted. Someone she had taken to a client dinner. Someone who owed her. What she found was 20 people looking at her with the flat patience of a jury. Audrey Keene walked past her without a word, opened the manager's office, collected the company laptop and the corporate card and the parking transponder, and placed each item into a property bag with the deliberateness of a woman finally doing something she had wanted to do for 4 years. She sealed it, labeled it, and handed it to the younger officer. Then the elevator doors closed on Victoria Wainwright, and the technical wing exhaled all at once. At 4 o'clock, the company-wide announcement went out to every employee across 11 offices, subject line reading that Darnell Price had been appointed Senior Vice President of Operations. Nathaniel Brooks read it standing up at his desk and then sat down slowly, running the entire morning backward through his head. He thought about the man who had asked for 9 days of logs instead of 3. He thought about the 17 minutes that man had spent being called unpolished in front of 20 people, while a $40 million contract quietly finished saving itself behind him. He thought, mostly, about how close he had come to keeping his mouth shut. He had not, and it was going to matter more than he knew. Audrey Keene submitted 11 pages within 36 hours, and everything in them was dated, named, and verifiable, because she had been quietly keeping records for 2 years without ever admitting to herself that she was building a case. Nathaniel supplied a chain of messages from the previous winter in which a performance rating had been revised downward 4 days after he questioned a vendor selection. 6 other employees came forward in the first week, and then 9 more, and a pattern assembled itself that surprised nobody who had worked there and horrified everyone who had not. Victoria Wainwright had been genuinely charming, generous, and warm to anyone she believed had standing, and she had been cruel, precise, and tireless with anyone she had decided could not fight back. The office had 2 completely different weather systems, and which one you lived in depended entirely on her 4-second assessment of you. So Darnell changed the machinery, which is the only kind of revenge that outlasts the person it is aimed at. Every complaint concerning a manager now routes directly to Central Human Resources with an automatic case number so that no local leader can withdraw, redirect, or quietly close a report about themselves. Regional managers can no longer summon building security to resolve a personnel dispute, full stop, with a mandatory review of any exception. Every performance rating carries a formal appeal path that lands on a desk 2 levels above the rating manager. And every leadership scorecard in the company gained a section that had never been on it before, in which authority is measured against accountability rather than revenue alone. He wrote the last one himself, and it took him 4 drafts. Graham Whitlock called at 7 minutes past 6, when the floor had mostly emptied and the windows had gone dark. He was 59, he had signed the appointment personally, and he had already heard 3 versions of the day from 3 different people. "So," he said, "how was your first day?" Darnell was standing at the end of the technical wing looking at the desk he had chosen that morning, the ugly one by the environmental panel that nobody else wanted. The chair was still pushed out at the angle he had left it. "I learned a lot," he said. There was a pause on the line, the kind an experienced chairman leaves on purpose. "About the systems?" Graham asked, and Darnell looked at the empty room, at the 20 chairs whose occupants had spent 6 years learning to look at the carpet, at the office door with a nameplate that maintenance would remove in the morning. "About people," he said. Graham was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would see him at the board session on Thursday, and that he was glad it was him. Neither of them mentioned Victoria Wainwright's name. Darnell left the building a little after 8, and he left it the same way he had entered it. No motorcade at the curb, no applause in the lobby, no line of people waiting to shake his hand, no photograph for an internal newsletter. Just a 41-year-old man in a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, carrying a scratched laptop bag on one shoulder, holding the door for the night cleaner on his way out, because that is simply who he was at 8 in the morning and at 8 at night. The security officer at the desk said, "Good evening, Mr. Price," and he said good evening back and used the man's name. Outside, the parking lot was nearly empty and the air had finally cooled. His phone buzzed against his hip as he crossed the asphalt, and it was the reminder he had set for himself the night before, 1 line of plain text about fractions and a promise. He called home from the middle of the lot, and a young voice picked up on the second ring and immediately began explaining, at considerable length and with real indignation, why one particular worksheet problem was unfair. He listened to all of it. He did not mention the board, or the title, or the woman who had asked who let him in, because none of that belonged in that phone call, and because a man who needs his daughter to know he is important has already lost something more valuable than a promotion. He said he would be home by 9:30, and he meant it. Before he got into the car, Darnell turned and looked back at the building one more time, at the 3rd floor where a few lights were still burning. That morning, a woman had looked at his shirt and his laptop and his face and decided in 4 seconds that he did not belong in that place. She had said it out loud, in front of 20 witnesses, and then she had picked up a phone to make it official. She had been so certain. She had been given 5 chances to check, and had refused every one of them because checking would have meant admitting that her judgment was a guess wearing a good suit. By evening, the only thing in that building that genuinely no longer belonged there was her authority. It had never really been hers, as it turned out. It had been lent to her by an arrangement that measured what she produced and never once measured what she cost. And the moment somebody finally did the second calculation, the loan was called in inside of 15 minutes. Darnell got into his car, set the old laptop bag on the passenger seat, and drove home to check a fractions worksheet. Behind him, in an office where 20 people would arrive the next morning to a very different kind of workplace, the weather had changed for good.